The issue of Talmud Torah, what they call here in Israel Torato Uminato, versus Giyus Tzahal, has really impacted the religious community for decades. But I think it took on like a new impetus in the light of this war. And we've discussed on many occasions that the Rambam has three categories of Milchemes Mitzvah, the last of which is Lahatzil Es Yisrael Miad Tsar, which is the present situation that we're in. But we're going to approach this topic from a more general perspective. And I think the issue at stake, at the heart of it, is the question of how do we win the war? When Klal Yisrael go out to battle, is it merely a military operation, and we should understand it as such, or is there another element? And we're going to try to prove from, of all people, Avimelech, Melech Plishtim, that there's another element in the equation. And it's not just about strategy and ammunition and the power and the forces of the military. There's another very important element that goes into the equation. Now, I think that we're going to have to raise the question of hashkafa versus halacha, in the sense that sometimes there are concepts that come from the world of Agadata that may or may not have any impact on halacha. And I think this example is very, very much in that light, in that context. We may come with Agadatas that seem to indicate one thing, but the halacha would seem to indicate something entirely different. Beyond that, we should, I think, put on our thinking caps about a framework for this question, which I think belongs to the famous statement of Chazal, Im ein kemach ein Torah, which means that with regard to Torah, as great as a mitzvah is, Chazal call it shakol keneged kulam, but yet we need kemach, we need life, we need sustenance. And if we go with the shita, for example, of Rabbi Yishmael in Masechta Brachos, we need to get involved in malacha, in finding a source of income, even if only as a means to an end. Even if we classify kemach as secondary, and in ein kemach, ein Torah, so that kemach is a critical means to the end, but the ultimate end is Torah. So that our issue tonight very much fits into that general framework of the physical versus the spiritual. Because if Torah is to be defined as our spiritual goal, in the sense that it gives us our stature, our relationship to the Almighty, our understanding of morality and how to live our lives, and Torah uplifts us. But nevertheless, we can't just jump into a world of spirituality because God put us in a world of physicality. Now let's begin with Avimelech Melech Plishtim, the way the Psukim seem to present it, and this is a parsha in Parshas Toldos that has to do with Yitzchak Avinu. And you may recall that the Plishtim did not treat Yitzchak properly. That's an understatement. And they basically rejected him, exiled him, girshu oto, they threw him out. And you may recall that in the earlier generation, Avram had entered into a covenant relationship with Avimelech, a kind of a peace treaty, if you will, a commitment of no war, that we will live in the land in a kind of a amicable situation. Now, we have a principle that touches on perhaps the very establishment of the state of Israel, and that is when a covenant is violated by one side of the agreement, it becomes invalid, and the other side of the agreement no longer is bound to its original commitment within the framework of the original covenant, the original bris. And therefore, we can begin to understand, and the Ramban amplifies this, the fear in the hearts of Avimelech regarding the possibility that Yitzchak, having been treated so harshly, might become a formidable enemy against the Plishtim and defeat Plishtim. And that's because the covenant of Abraham is no longer binding. Having been violated by the Plishtim, no longer is the fledgling Jewish nation committed to that bris. And this, says the Ramban, is going to compel Avimelech to enter into a second bris, a brand new bris, with Yitzchak Avinu. And here the question arises, what is Avimelech really afraid of? When we say that Yitzchak is going to come and attack the Plishtim and exile the Plishtim from the land, let's read the psukim. V'Avimelech halach elav migrar. Avimelech, together with his commander-in-chief, seeks a meeting with Yitzchak in the city of Gerar. Vayomer aleim Yitzchak madua basam elai. Vatem snesim osi vatshalchuni mitchem. Your hatred against me led to your exiling me. Vayomru, now listen to this. We can anticipate that Avimelech, if he'd be perfectly upfront, he would say, Yitzchak, you're a powerful army. No. Ra'o ra'inu ki haya Hashem yudke vavke imach, etc., etc. So that Avimelech spills the beans when he tells us that what motivates him, what compels him to try to recreate that old bris, is not necessarily Yitzchak's power on the battlefield, but the fact that we are well aware of the fact that Hashem imach, that the Almighty God is with you. The Inyan, says the Ramban, Hayira Azos Asher Pachtu Mimenu. What is the fear in the hearts of Avimelech and the Plishtim? Are they afraid of Yitzchak? Shelo Yavoi Lav Yitzchak L'Milchama? Is Yitzchak such a powerful force? He's got so many brigades and air force and land soldiers. And then the Ramban goes on to say that it's all about the bris, and it's all about the violation of the bris. And as the pasuk says, Ki haya Hashem imach. And I present this as an introduction to our discussion because I think it adds another element to the issue of milchama, and for that matter, army service, and the success in the battlefield. Ki haya Hashem imach. The argument in favor of conscription, of non-exemption, but the obligation incumbent upon every Jew, certainly every young man, to fight the battle on behalf of Klal Yisrael, is firmly rooted in the concept of chesed. What greater chesed could there be than defending the people of Israel, the millions of Jews that live in the state of Israel? But I think we have to ask ourselves the question of the relationship between Torah and chesed. And this question, I think, should be broken down into two component parts. And we very often miss the point as to the fundamental difference between these two parts of the issue. One part is called dechia. If you were students in my class, I would ask you to write this down. Dalid ches yud yud he. Whenever you have a clash, shall we call it a tug of war between two mitzvos, you have to ask yourself the question of dechia. In English, for lack of a better word, I would use the word priority. Priority in a very practical sense. If it's ef shalakayim shneim, I cannot fulfill both mitzvos, then which mitzvah takes precedence? Which gets priority? And that's called the laws of dechia. For example, the Netziv Mivalazhin, in his introduction to Parshas Vayera, when the three, we'll call them Arabs or Malachim or angels, come to visit Avram Avinu, the Netziv has a very original answer to an old question, Shadoshu Be'ramim. Why the repetition of the word Vayar? It says Vayar Avram, and then it says Vayar Vayoretz L'krosam. If you take a look at the Psukim, it repeats itself twice. And then Netziv, as a Baal Halacha, puts on his halachic thinking cap and says the following. The first Vayar means simply, literally, Avram saw these passers-by. But what happens between the first Vayar and the second Vayar? It says in Netziv, Avram was going through an entire halachic thinking process. Why? Because Yitzchak, at that moment in time, I said Yitzchak again. Avram, at that moment in time, was preoccupied with a great mitzvah, the mitzvah of Kabbalas Pnei Shechina, because God had appeared to Avram Avinu on the third day of Milah, etc., etc. And according to the Netziv, between the first Vayar and the second Vayar, Avram Avinu was vacillating back and forth. What should I do? Should I drop the ball on the mitzvah of Kabbalas Pnei Shechina in favor of the mitzvah of Achnosis Orchim? Or no, Osik v'mitzvah, potem b'na mitzvah. Don't get distracted from the mitzvah that you're involved in right now, the great mitzvah of receiving the Shechina. What happened in between the two? Avram Avinu, like a real first-class Volozhin or yeshiva bacher, decided that it depends upon another principle called Efshar L'Kayim Al Yidei Achirim. Can you send someone else to do the second mitzvah? If there's no option, it's you or no mitzvah at all, then the halacha would require that you drop the first mitzvah in order to do the second mitzvah. If, on the other hand, you could send a shliach and continue your occupation with this askus in the mitzvah that you're osek in, then let someone else do the mitzvah. And Avram Avinu noticed that these three individuals were standing together, and the leader of them was sort of surrounded by the other two. Avram Avinu wanted to send Yishmael. I'm preoccupied with the mitzvah of Kabbalas Pnei Shechina. But then Avram Avinu realized that these three people were mechubadim, and therefore it would not be appropriate. The mitzvah could not be accomplished by young Yishmael, who was just a bar mitzvah boy, and that the mitzvah would have to be fulfilled by Avram himself. Now, jumping back into our perspective here, our relevant sugya, how do we juggle between Talmud Torah, the great mitzvah, and chesed? And the first halacha is kedima. Kedima means that when it comes to Talmud Torah, we suspend the principle of osek b'mitzvah poter b'mitzvah. And that's based in the sugya in Kiddushin on the principle called Gadol Talmud HaMevil L'dei Maisa. And therefore, the Maisa mitzvah is machayev, and he has to stop learning Torah for the sake of implementing the Maisa mitzvah. In our case, there's a great mitzvah of Hatzolas Klal Yisrael, and that mitzvah would gain priority over the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And in this perspective, which let's call it Roman numeral number 1 in our issue, then there's no question about it. There's no room for exemption from a mitzvah as great as chesed, of saving Klal Yisrael, because one is preoccupied with the study of Torah. But we want to introduce a second element into the equation when we talk about this tug of war that pulls you in two directions: Torah study and chesed. And that is, which mitzvah is greater? Is the mitzvah of Torah study greater? Or is the mitzvah of Hatzolas Nefashos greater? And one would say, intuitively, what mitzvah could possibly be greater than Hatzolas Nefashos? As the Mishnah tells us in Masechta Sanhedrin, Hamatzil Nefesh Achas MiYisrael Ki Ma'ilal Avakasa Kilu Hitzels Kol Olam Kulo. What could be greater? The Gemara calls Pidyon Shvuyim a mitzvah rabbah. Hatzolas Nefashos. And yet, paradoxically, the Taz comes up with a different formula. His conclusion is based on a Gemara Masechta Megillah regarding Mordechai. At the end of the Megillah, you'll remember, it says, V'rotzui l'rov echad, which means that after the Hatzalah, when Esther revealed who she was and who Mordechai was to her, Mordechai left the Sanhedrin, where he was preoccupied with Torah and Horos, the Hadalacha, and he was involved Yom V'Layla in Hatzolas Nefashos to save Jews from the hands of the Amalekim. And Chazal say, Rotzui l'rov echav. Rov echav lo kol echav. Says the Taz, who lived about 5 centuries ago, 4.5, that Mordechai went down a level. He had lost some of his personal status. We might call it his spirituality, his relationship to the Almighty. That closeness that he had once had when he was totally, exclusively preoccupied with Torah and the dissemination of Torah knowledge, now he was involved in Hatzolas Nefashos. Says the Taz, as great of a mitzvah as Hatzolas Nefashos is concerned, that's midin dechiyah. Mordechai had no choice. Al pi halacha, he was bound to stop his preoccupation with Torah study for the sake of the mitzvah of Hatzolas Nefashos. But in terms of his personal level, there is nothing equivalent to the study of Torah to generate a closeness to Hashem, to elevate the spiritual makeup of a person. So we now have another consideration, another element in the equation. Besides the halacha of dechia, we have a halacha which I would call the mahus ha-mitzvah, the essence of the mitzvah itself. So which is greater, Torah study or chesed? Imagine the case of a Talmud Chacham who's preoccupied, sincerely dedicated Yom V'Layla, v'gisa b'Yom V'Layla to study of Torah. Imagine a rofei, a physician who's totally dedicated to saving lives. Yom V'Layla. He can't shut off his phone at night. Their lives on the line. Would we ask the question of priority? Hands down. Drop your Torah study for the sake of chesed. But if we're asking a question of the essential, shall we call it the spiritual nature of these two mitzvos, then we would put Torah study on top. Are you following me so far? Just to set up a framework so we see where we're going with this. And here, we learn a very fascinating Gemara in Avodah Zarah Yud Zayin and Beis regarding Harugei Malchus. And both Rabbi Elazar ben Parta and Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion were taken by the Romans. It seems that Rabbi Elazar ben Parta was guilty in the eyes of the Romans of 5 different counts of violating the law of the government, whereas Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion was only guilty of teaching Torah, 1 and not 5. Amalei Rabbi Hananya, Ashrecha shenitpasta al chamisha dvarim v'ata nitzol. I can guarantee you, says Rabbi Hananya to Rabbi Elazar, that you will be spared. You will survive. Va'ani oili shenitpasti al davar echad v'eini nitzol. Why? Explain to us, Rabbi Hananya. Why is Rabbi Elazar going to be saved and spared and you will die? What is the divine perspective here? Says Rabbi Hananya, Atah sakta b'Torah u'b'gemilus chasadim. You dedicated your life not only to the study of Torah, and you were a great giant and scholar, but also to Gemilus Chasadim. You were in charge of this, in charge of that. Ani lo asakti ela b'Torah bilvad. And the clincher of this Gemara, of this Haggadah, is a statement of Huna. It's hard for me to get the words out of my mouth. It's so shocking what Rav Huna says. The Omer Rav Huna kol osek b'Torah bilvad dome kemisha ein lo aloka. The perspective of this sugya in Avodah Zarah Yud Zayin is so radically different than the presentation of the Taz. The Taz is saying that if we could get a divine perspective from a spiritual point of view, there's no question that Torah study is greater than Atzolos Nefashos, which is the greatest of Chesed. And yet the Gemara says that in the eyes of the Ribono Shel Olam, he who dedicates himself exclusively to Torah study is not on the same level as he who splits his time between Talmud Torah and Gemilus Chasadim and integrates both in his life. Now, of course, Rabbi say this is an Haggadah, but it's a very powerful Haggadah because of 2 reasons. First of all, this actually took place. And if you have any doubts about whether Rabbi Hananya was telling us how great is Rabbi Elazar because of his integration, take a look at Rav Huna. Rav Huna would say that osek b'Torah bilvad is kamisha ein lo eloka. And I'm reminded, of course, of the Gemara in Masechta Sota that compares Abai to Rava. They were both from Bnei Eli, descendants of Eli that had a curse after Chofni and Pinchas's misdemeanor, that they would die young. Rava died at the age of 40. Again, something that almost defies our imagination. Abai died at the age of 60. And the Gemara explains, why is it that Abai lived 20 years? That's half the life of Rava, more beyond the life of Rava. Survived him by 20 years. And the Gemara says because Rava was Osek b'Torah bilvad, whereas Abai split his time between Torah and Gemilas Chasodim. Says the Chafetz Chaim in his famous work Avas HaChesed that if Abai split his time, then from the 40 years that he was originally allotted, like his colleague Rava, he spent 20 years dedicated to Chesed. I don't mean 20 years continuous, but the equivalent, Sach HaKol, of 20 years. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him back to 20 years. And he lived until the age of 60. In a sense, we can sort of go home at this point. Because having seen the Gemara in Avodah Zarah and the statement of Rav Huna, and having defined and classified service in Tzahal as a great chesed, perhaps the greatest of chesed, then mimanavshach. Whether we look at it from the perspective of Kedima, of the practical issue of what to do when there's a conflict and a clash, or from the perspective of what does the ideal Jew look like? Where does Torah and Chesed fit in, and which one is greater? And even from that perspective, he who combines the two, Torah and Chesed, would be on a higher level than he who is exclusively dedicated to the study of Torah. It's an amazing conclusion. However, what about the element that we began with? That perhaps when we go out to battle, the decision, no, that's not the word I need. The final conclusion of the battle, whether it'll be in our favor of Chas v'Sholom not, is not just determined by the physical element of fighting in the military. And there's another element in the equation. And now we get to brass tacks, because I think everything is going to boil down to this following question. What does a meta-legal consideration, what I mean by meta-legal means some sort of a midah of bitachon, of emunah, of faith, does it play any role whatsoever in the world of halacha? Because if we're talking about exemption from army duty, then we're in the world of halacha. We're talking about something practical. Lemaisa. Does the Torah, does the halacha recognize an exemption from fighting in the army based on Torah? Torah Tov, not Torah, as we mentioned at the outset. And there's an amazing sugya of Bava Basra, which honestly, when I learned this sugya of Bava Basra, that's what I'm teaching these days, I thought this is agadita. Don't take this seriously. Has no halachic ramifications. And again, the sugya starts on Daf Zayin Amud Beis, goes through Daf Ches, and it's all about a statement of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, Rabbanan lo boy netirusa. What does that mean? Literally translated, the Chachamim, those who are dedicated to Torah, learning and scholarship, they don't need protection. They're above protection. And the sugya develops an entire issue called Chovas B'nei Ha'ir. These are taxes that are imposed by the city municipality, I guess we would call it the Iriyah, to raise funds and earmark these tax monies for the defense and the protection of the city. This was very relevant, of course, in the land of Israel, where every city had to be fortified because of the threat of an attack from the goyim around us. And in that sense, this sugya really talks to us today. To Shmini Atzeres of Shabbos of October 7th, Leminyanim. Where were our fortifications? So protection costs money. On the side, by the way, this is not, this I'm sharing with my friends here. When I say Baruch Aleinu 3 times a day, and this is since I'm a bar mitzvah boy, I have in mind that there should be funds for Israeli soldiers. Now you've seen 1,001 collections. You know, the last one I saw was for the special glasses. You saw that one? Because it seems like 17% of our soldiers are losing some of their eyesight with all that they do. And there's a certain protective lens that they could wear. It's hon to afod. And somebody is raising money. They want to raise enough for 500 soldiers. And that's like a modest effort. Thousands and thousands of dollars. But again, you'll see every Monday and Thursday, you'll see another collection for this, for that. And this is a tax. And we're all paying taxes here in Israel for the protection of cities, walls for cities. The Gemara talks about shomrim, setting up guards that have to be paid a salary. The Gemara talks about setting up on the outside of the wall around the city a kind of a budka, we would call, kind of a place for making sure who goes in and who goes out. There's a lot of expenses involved. And Reish Lakish says you cannot collect these taxes from Talmidei Chachamim. How does Reish Lakish know that Torah is going to protect the scholars? He darshans it from a pasuk in Shir Hashirim. Ani choma v'shadai kemigdalos. And what do we derive from this pasuk? The pasuk is referring to Talmidei Chachamim. They are kemigdalos. They're like protective outposts where we guard the people of Israel. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole sugya now because the Gemara goes back and forth exactly how to interpret that pasuk in Shir Hashirim. But the bottom line is that Rabbanan lo tzrichen netirusa. The Gemara makes an exception to the rule in the case of digging ditches in order to receive the rainwater and create cisterns for the water that we need and highways to get from one place to the other. In those cases, we will collect from the Talmidei Chachamim no less than your rank and file citizen. Why? Because the tax is collected from those who need the tax, who need the result of the tax. The tax is earmarked towards a certain agenda, to a certain end. In the case of water, the Talmidei Chacham need to drink water no less than anyone else, and therefore they'll pay the tax for the water. In the case of highways and so forth, they need to travel no less than anyone else. Fascinating, the Gemara says that even though the Talmidei Chachamim are obligated to participate in the tax for water, we will not have them dig the ditches for the water, because that's already a zilzul in Kvod Torah. So I looked at this Gemara and I said to myself, give it a break. I mean, what do you mean, Talmidei Chacham lo boine tirusa? I mean, this is like a metaphysical principle, some sort of divine level of bitachon. And many of them Farshim go as far as to say that on a metaphysical level, not only do the Talmidei Chachamim not need protection, right? That was a double negative. But in addition, they're the ones who solve the problem of the danger that Klal Yisrael is facing. Klal Yisrael is facing a danger because of the Amei Haaretz, because of the ignorant Jews that are not dedicating themselves to the study of Torah. And what's going to balance, what's going to save the Jews? It's the Torah of the Talmidei Chachamim. And then you want to ask them to pay the taxes, to build the wall, to fortify the city? Okay, fine, it's all Agadita. It's all metaphysics. It's all a question of faith in something that's beyond nature. And yet, again, if you have the pages that I gave you on page 2, let's look in the Rambam. The Rambam paskins this sugya not once, but twice. Very unusual. In Hilchas Talmud Torah Perek Vav, Talmidei Chachamim Einam Yotzim Bi'atzmam Mikol Yisrael B'Binyan U'B'Chafira. Okay, we don't want them to go out there in the ditches and dig the ground up because the Rambam says Lo Yizbazu Mifnei Amei Haaretz. Fine. Okay, that I understand. Maybe it's Efshar Lidei Acherim. Others will dig the ditches. But what about the tax? We will not collect the funds from them to build the wall around the city. Every wall has to have gates so that people can get in and out. And to pay a price, a salary for the watchman. Now the Rambam here in Hilchas Talmud Torah doesn't go into detail as to why the Talmidei Chachamim are exempt from these taxes. He brings it down in Hilchas Talmud Torah after having established the principle or the prohibition of what's called Karadom Lach Porbo. The Rambam is absolutely opposed to Talmidei Chachamim drawing from public communal monies, funds, in order to support themselves. And in that context, he says, but certain taxes they don't have to pay. And the community will pick up the bill on those taxes. But he doesn't really get into the question why. But if we fast forward from the beginning of the Rambam to the end of the Rambam, Hilchas Shchenim, which is almost in the last book of the Rambam, not quite. Any funds that have to be collected for the protection of the city, so normally we treat the Yisomim, young children who are orphaned, in a different kind of a way. But here, the lives are at stake and the city has to be protected. Chutz mi Talmidei Chacham. Talmidei Chacham will not pay these taxes. Why? It's hard to believe that we're listening to the Rambam. She'ein Talmidei Chacham tzrichim shmira. She'torosam shomrosam. You know, we're not going to say to a Talmid Chacham, don't go out to work. You know what? Man will will flow from Shemayim. Have bitachon. We're going to tell the Talmid Chacham to go out and get a job. Who remembers Dobie Gillis? Work. Okay, I'm dating myself. Anyway, got to go out to work. Emein kemach ein Torah. And the same Rambam, who goes on an absolute tirade, I've never seen anything like it in the Rambam, against Talmidei Chachamim who use the badge of Torah in order to pull in money from the communal chests, and the Rambam fights against this tooth and nail. The same Rambam says that the Torah shomrosam, which is metaphysical, doesn't seem like a halacha. You know, the Rambam could have omitted this. He could have, we would barely pay attention if the Rambam told us, okay, there's certain taxes that Talmidei Chacham are exempt from. Maybe their financial situation is very weak. They don't have too much money in the bank. We don't want to, We want to draw off too much of their fun. You can come up with all sorts of explanations. The Rambam didn't even have to offer me an explanation. But yet the Rambam codifies the statement of Reish Lakish in Bava Basra Zayin Amid Beis, Talmid Chacham lo boy netirusa. And why? Because Torasam Shomrasam. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, on an issue that could cost hon torafot, they are exempt. I was totally shocked. I learned the sugya and I said, this is Haggadik, this is metaphysics, this can't be halacha l'maisa. But the Gemara was not joking. And Reish Lakish was not trying to pull the wool over our eyes. The Rambam codifies this halacha twice, once in Hilchos Talmud Torah. The community will bear the burden, financial burden of anything that's necessary for Shmirah. And a second time in Hilchos Shchenim, when he spills the beans and writes, Ein Talmidei Chacham Tzrichem Shmirah, Shat Torah Shomrosim. And now I'd like to share with you, I mean, for you, it's a chazara, you know this Rambam by heart. I mean, I'm not inventing the wheel over here. The famous last Rambam in Hilchos Shemitah V'Yovel. And the question is Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi is supported by the tzibur. They don't go to work. They get maisros. And we, the people of Israel, will support the Levim. Okay, I can understand that. The Levim have to be dedicated to service in the temple. If you would take a Levi and tell him, go to work, then maybe he wouldn't be able to fulfill that function that we as a community need so much. So instead of getting paid for his work as a shoer or meshorer, he will collect maaseh. Fine. But let's not go beyond Shevet Levi. No one else could collect communal funds just because he is involved and dedicated with a devotion and a commitment exclusively to serve Hashem. And here's the famous Rambam. The Rambam says, Loma lo zocha Levi b'nachlas Eretz Yisrael b'bizosa mipnei shehuvdal la'avodas Hashem l'sharso. The Leviim are set aside for avodas Hashem, l'shareis b'migdash, lahoros drachav. They will be the teachers of Israel. Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'torascha liYisrael, lefichach huvdalu midarkei ha'olam. They are no longer thrust into the principle of im ein kemach, ein Torah. V'lo orchim milchama kishar Yisrael. They don't go out to battle like the balance of Israel. Elohim chel Hashem. Sounds like Lubavitch almost. Chel Hashem. Shenemar barech Hashem chelu. Sok the Rambam, one of the most famous Rambams in the Mishnah Torah. V'lo shevet Levi bilvad. This is not a matter of genetics. I understand, maybe you guys could set me straight on this, that Rav Nachman Kahana Shlita has done research on a certain gene that a Kohen has that Israel doesn't have. You familiar with this? This has been his project for years and years. So I don't know if you have a Levi gene, because I know wherever I go, we're missing Levium. I know the Sfaradim don't seem to have that problem. They have plenty of Levium. I don't know, amongst the Ashkenazim, I can't find a Levi for the life of me. I can find 5 Kohanim and maybe 1 Levi if I'm lucky. So maybe we should take genetic testing. Says the Rambam that you and I, who are not Levium genetically, can become Levium. We can gain, if we want to, just on a Yozma Yishit, on a personal level, the status of a Levi. How so? Ela kol ish v'ish mikol ba'olam. Again, I have a lot to talk about this boy olam. I would have said kol ish v'ish Yisrael, but the Rambam writes boy olam. Asher nodva rucho. Nodva rucho means his heart prompts him. There's something in his neshama, his nefesh, that prompts him, ve'vino midei mado, and his level of understanding, libadel v'lama lifnei Hashem, the same words that he used in the first paragraph to describe Levi, lisharso liovdo ladas Hashem, v'holach yosha, and he's honest, he's sincere. This is not a fly-by-night kind of thing. Because God created man straight. Uparak me'al tzavaro ola cheshbonos harabim. He decides, I'm jumping in to the array. I'm part of Shevet Levi. I am an unofficial member of Shevet Levi, not genetically. And I don't have cheshbonos harabim. Forget about all the cheshbonos harabim. Cheshbonos that belong to this world, the world of nature. I'm out of this. Harezen is kadesh kodesh kadoshim. V'yi Hashem chelko v'nachloso liolam. Now, in Yirtzeh Hashem, I don't know if we'll get to it tonight. I don't know what time it is. But I want to talk to you about Rav Aaron Lichtenstein's magnum opus on the Hesder Yeshiva movement, called The Ideology of Hesder, that was published in 1981 in Tradition magazine. I'm sure it's been translated to Hebrew. I don't have access to the Hebrew translation, but it was written by Rav Lichtenstein in English, and you and I know he was a PhD in English from Harvard. So his English, like every other sentence, I got to take out a dictionary. Such a flowery English. And he's medayik in this Rambam of Niskadesh Kodesh Kadoshim that we're talking about someone on a very high level. And Rav Lichtenstein claims that this is miuta de miuta. We'll see it inside next week, if you're still interested in this topic. If you want, we can go on to something else. V'yeh Hashem chelko v'nachloso li'olav uli'ol me'olam. V'yizke lo b'avoda b'olam hazeh davar maspik lo kefi shezoch l'kodim levin. Bitachon. Hashem will take care of him. He doesn't say explicitly that he's going to collect masros, but the implication is that, we should be supporting such a person. But certainly, the Rambam is saying, uparak me'al tzavaro ol cheshbonos harab. And all this is in contrast to the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah Perek Gimel, which I hinted at before. The Rambam just goes on a tirade for anyone who's porek me'olav ol cheshbonos harab. And this Rambam in Shemitah v'Yovel, together with the Rambam in Hilchos Shchenim, puts our issue in a whole different perspective. Because as I asked you in the outset, do we base halacha l'maaseh on agadic statements? And we always have to be sensitive to certain agadic statements in the Gemara that have practical ramifications, that are so fundamental that they spill over from the world of hashkafa into the world of halacha. The Rambam in Shemitah v'Yovel is talking about halacha l'maaseh. He's not giving us an agadic statement about how a person can rely on Hashem and the man is going to come down from Shamayim. God will take care of him because he's exclusively dedicated and devoted in all sincerity to Torah study, to serve Hashem. The Rambam is telling you halacha here. The same Rambam who tirades against someone who is porek me'olav cheshbonos harabim for the sake of Torah, the same Rambam says that you could become part of Shevet Levi, an associate or auxiliary member of the Levi club, and Hashem will take care of you, which is perhaps the most radical change in a person's life. There's nothing more practical than the Rambam in Shemitah v'Yovel. And to boot, the principle of Talmidei Chacham Einim Tzrichim Netira, which is purely metaphysical, And it's all based on a hashkafa of a divine intervention and a faith and a belief on the level of bitachon that the Gemara says about Yosef HaTzadik, that he shouldn't have asked the Sar HaMashkim to remind him to Paro. That level now is applicable to Talmidei Chachamim straight across the board, and they don't pay taxes for the sake of Shmir. Those monies that are earmarked for the protection of the city. And then we have the famous Agadita in Masechta Nedarim. What was Avram Avinu's sin? Shenishtabdu banav leMitzrayim, Masayim v'Yeser Shon. And the Gemara offers three answers to this question. One of them is Avram Avinu says, Bameh Eda ki Eresheno, is a lack of faith. And the other answer is because Hifrish b'nei Adam ilikanes tachas kanfei Ashchina, and that's Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. But the Gemara itself, without quoting any name, anonymously, offers a third explanation. The word Angaria, which probably is Greek, certainly Aramaic, means conscription. Avram conscripted Talmidei Chachamim. Who are these Talmidei Chachamim that were steiging away in Avram's yeshiva, or maybe in the yeshiva Shem V'Yever? These were the 318 soldiers in Avram Avinu's battalion. And Avram Avinu sinned, according to this Gemara, because he conscripted these Talmidei Chacham to fight a battle. Now, you could always argue that Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel rejected this. I don't know. It's possible that they accepted this, but they didn't think that that sin would have any impact on generations to come, as opposed to an explicit lack of emunah or lack of bringing Jews tachas kanfei Ashchina. But the Gemara does go on record as suggesting that Avram Avinu should not have conscripted Talmidei Chacham. Once again, the counter argument is you're talking about Agadita. We don't base halachic conclusions on an Agadita. Everybody knows this Agadita. But does it have any practical meaning? Let's mention another Agadita. You remember when we were speaking at the beginning of our series about Reb Chaim Shmulevitz and what he told his yeshiva students in the Mir at the time of the Yom Kippur War? And he rams it into them that they have to be totally dedicated to Torah. And why? Quoting the Medrash. The Medrash says on the Kfelus, it says in the Pasuk, Elef Lamata, Elef Lamata. Why Elef Lamata, Elef Lamata twice? And the Medrash says that Elef went out to the Milchama and Elef were involved in Tefillah, and Reb Chaim says in Torah. What an awesome responsibility. But is that the way we organize an army to fight our enemy? Splitting, as it were, the Shevet into two? Dividing it in half? Another Agadic statement from the Medrash. And once again, we don't base halach on Agadit. But yet we saw in at least two cases the Rambam takes what we think is metaphysical, that's based on emunah hashkafa in faith and bitachon, and he paskins halacha l'maisa. And a person could be horek ol cheshbonos harabim, just like Shevet Levi, because he's totally dedicated li'avdo u'lisharso u'mado, and he's niskadesh b'kodesh kadosh. And such a person is exempt from paying taxes that are earmarked for protection of the city. The picture is very complicated. And finally, another Agadic statement that seems to indicate that there's room for Talmidei Chachamim who don't go out to battle to add another element in the equation. To paraphrase Avimelech, Ki Hashem haya imach, in the Gemara in Sanhedrin Mem Tes, with regard to David and Yoav. Yoav was the commander-in-chief. He went out to the front lines. David was dedicated to the study of Torah. Vilmole Yoav lo asak David b'Torah. Yoav was playing a secondary role. Like we said before, im ein kemach, ein Torah. Kemach is a tofel, is a means to an end of Torah. And Yoav's battle in the front lines was a means to an end to allow David HaMelech to study Torah. Tichsiv, Vayehi David Osem Mishparut Staka L'chol A'o V'Yoav Ben Tzuri Al Hatzava. It was a partnership. And how was David HaMelech able to achieve this preoccupation with Torah study? Because Yoav is Al Hatzava. It reminds us in a very striking way of Yisachar and Zvulun, of a partnership in which Zvulun lechof amim yishkan, and Zvulun is out there at the head of commerce in the ships, going from country to country, bringing back merchandise, and so forth and so on, and he's supporting Yisachar. So is there an argument for Toraso Umnaso to be exempt from the army in order to create this partnership, if you will? If we introduce elements from the metaphysical world, again, it's an agadita. And then the question becomes very sticky, very practical, but very complex. Who deserves to be categorized as Toraso Umnaso Sheniskadesh Kodesh Kadoshim? Are we going to carte blanche say that all yeshiva students are exempt from the army? And then on the flip side, does every able-bodied man in Israel have to go out to the army? Should we close up the whole country? Have you seen men walking the streets of Israel? Maybe a few even in Alon Shvut. Why aren't they out there in the front lines of the battlefield? Why aren't they being conscripted? Apparently, it might be Efshal L'Kayim Al Yidei Acheret. But one thing is crystal clear from this whole discussion. I want to make sure that one thing we understand, as we say in Yiddish, upgeret. There's no question about it. If it comes to a situation where we need every last able-bodied man to fight against our enemy, there's no question about it. We spoke about a Rodef. We spoke about even running after the Rodef, even when he's not involved in a Meiser Redifa. This upständig Rodef, he's a Rodef that's made as a Rodef. Tmidi, he's a Rodef Tmidi. You remember that Rav, what's his name? The tshuva from the Frenchman. What's his name? Sorry.
Aviner.
Rav Aviner. That's crystal clear. On the other end of the spectrum, it also seems crystal clear that if it's not a situation in which we need every single body-able person to go out to the front lines, that there is room for this kind of a partnership and apply the principle of Talmidei Chacham lo boinen tirusa and the principle of lo shevet levi bilvad el niskadesh b'kodesh kadosh. And this is going to lead us into the hands of Rav Lichtenstein, the ideology of Hesed, which I'd love to discuss with you, if you're up to it, if you're interested. So let me take this opportunity. If any questions, any comments, I'm here. If not, to thank you for coming. spread the word. Maybe we can get some more people to join us.
Are you going to discuss the all this is good if we have a government that's following halacha. As a practical matter, in a secular state, it's,
But David, the point is that Torasum Naso is a legal term in the secular government. When I was a kid, they called it the 4D draft. You see, you weren't alive at the time of Vietnam, were you? It's way before you were born. But when we were fighting, Americans were fighting the Vietnamese, there was a draft exemption. They didn't use the word exemption. They had a different word for it. Deferral, I think it was called. And it was called a 4D deferral for yeshiva students, and there was members of other religions as well. And when the Vietnam War broke out, and hundreds of thousands of yeshiva students applied for a 4D, all of a sudden, yeshivas popped up everywhere. Okay, fine. I'm not trying to be cynical, but I'm not sure if all those guys, whatever. Anyway, I don't want to get into it. But in the Western civilization, within the legal system, there is something called a draft deferral. The question that we have to ask as halachic Jews is, do we feel an obligation, despite the exemption, despite the deferral, despite the fact that we are signed up in a yeshiva as Torasum Nasa, we're not going to take advantage of that, but rather we're going to go out to fight in Tzahal. And that's the issue that Rav Lichtenstein addresses in an essay called The Ideology of Hesder. But I thought it was important that before we jump into Rav Lichtenstein, we get a broad view of an array of Makoros that give us a certain perspective on what this issue is all about. But David, in a sense, I disagree with your comment, because I think even in the secular democratic state of Israel, this discussion that we're having is very relevant halachically. And as a man of halacha, we really want to develop a thesis. And again, you'll have views from here, there, and elsewhere. I'm not saying no. I'm not fooling myself into saying that we're going to read Rav Lichtenstein and this is going to be the final word in halacha. And keep in mind that the essay of Rav Lichtenstein was published 30 years ago. And things have changed over 30 years in both directions. But there is a legal category that's recognized by the Defense Ministry, Misrad HaBitachon, called Torasum Nasa. Again, they don't pronounce it the way I did, but And the question is, should we be training our children, raising our children to take advantage of that exemption? And I think that's a serious halakhic question that has tremendous repercussions in Hashkafa and in matters of life and death. Okay, then? All right, without further ado.
I just wanted to say something. I think since you see that the Rambam does take these agadas, it makes it into halacha. And it's not only general halacha, it's even choshen mishpat. That you're saying that people that are whatever the Gemara meant, these people, that they don't have to pay for the taxes of shmirah, because the Torah is their shmirah. Once it goes into the realm of halacha, then everything has to be very well defined. And therefore you need to define who exactly falls under this category of not having to pay for shmirah of the city, or who would not go to war in the case of a war.
So, Yechiel, I just want to add to strengthen your comment and support what you said. The words Talmid Chacham or Talmidei Chachamim appear throughout the Rambam, meaning throughout halacha, in many, many different contexts. And the research has to be done. Who qualifies, or as you said, is categorized as a Talmid Chacham? Is it a person who knows all of Shas? Is it a person who's Morah Horah? Is it a person who teaches Torah? Is it a person who has aspirations and potential in Torah? And this requires a tremendous amount of study. And I would very much recommend reading a book called Oz LaMelech. Forget it. It hasn't been published yet. Okay. But it's in manuscript form, 500 pages on the Rambam Hilchos Talmud Torah, and who is the Talmud Chacham. I happen to know the author pretty well.
Who's the author?
Myself.
Yourself, yeah, that's what I thought, right.
That's why I called it Oz.
Oh, of course, okay, sorry,
You know,
right,
Svarim
right.
on the Rambam are called La Melech, like the Mishnah La Melech and so forth and so on. So Oz is spelled Ayin Zayin. First two letters of my name. Anyway, so let me let you go now. And if you haven't eaten supper, enjoy your supper.
Okay.
I-
Shkoyach, thank you
I
very
need a
much.
psychiatrist, by the way, if you have a good one to recommend, because I'm having trouble enjoying my suppers. I just, and at night I just dream of, situations that are going on that our chayalim are facing. I remember on Hanukkah, I said to my wife, I'm off for an entire week of Hanukkah, from the beginning to the end, in two different jobs that I'm juggling here in Ramat Beit Shemesh. Let's go away for a week, right? And then I said to myself, my wife and I like traveling. I don't think we could do it. We can't do it. Not just because my son is somewhere in Aza, he doesn't tell us exactly where. We know he's with Sheshesh Tesha. And not just because I have two nephews. So I can go on. But I just don't know. I can't seem to. I'm so obsessed,
I think we all are.
But I don't know. Is that what
Especially if we have
Torah-
children there, but I'm saying besides that.
Yeah, but I don't know. Is that what the Torah wants us to, to be in a state of? We spoke at great length about the Iser Pachad in Milcham. You remember that discussion that we had?
No, but there's a thin line between caring and
Yeah.
apathy. You can't be apathetic. You can't care
Right.
too much either.
The Gemara in Tainis, by the way, says that during a period of war, you shouldn't be osek in period of a review. Like it's, there are indications of Chazal that we identify. I mean, we certainly identify, but I don't know. You can't take it to another extreme, because if you take it to extreme, you really need a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
How can you live your life, and function? Anyway, okay, Rabbi Osai, thank you so much.